You're listening to CommandCast, Episode 1, recorded Monday, October 14th, 2013. Hello, Commanders, and welcome to Episode 1 of CommandCast, the audio podcast dedicated to the new Command & Conquer free-to-play game. I am your host, Dub C. With me today are my co-hosts, Sabin.
Hello.
And Cybert is with me also today.
Hello.
We'll do more detailed introductions in just a moment, but first I wanted to introduce the CommandCast podcast to the listeners and briefly go over what we will be discussing in today's episode. The goal of CommandCast is to become the premier audio discussion podcast for the new Command & Conquer free-to-play game. Here on CommandCast, we'll be focusing exclusively on the new CNC free-to-play game, currently in alpha stage development. We'll be covering the game from head to toe with in-depth discussion about the progress of the game and interviews of both those in the alpha and from around the community. And eventually, our hope is that at some point, we can even score an interview down the road with some of the game's developers.
And there are, of course, several ways that you can catch episodes of this podcast. All episodes will be uploaded to the CommandCast YouTube channel and also broadcasted on trekradio.net. Episodes are available for streaming and download, and there's a link provided on the CommandCast blog. And you can go to commandcast.blogspot.com for links to all the podcasts as well as news and updates.
If you are a player or fan of Command & Conquer, and you'd like to join us on the future episodes of CommandCast, we would love to have you. Visit the CommandCast blog for contact links.
Thanks, guys. On this episode of CommandCast, we'll be introducing the listeners to the new Command & Conquer free-to-play game and bringing all of you up to speed on the current progress of the alpha in development. This includes the history of the game's development, the game's design and factions, and of course the latest updates and impressions from alpha gameplay. Next episode we'll be going more in-depth with the game's factions, including descriptions of the generals and their units. Before we begin our discussion, let's get a little background from our hosts. Let's start with Cybert, who graciously accepted my invitation to host this episode with us. Cybert, tell us briefly about your involvement in the Command & Conquer community and how you were first introduced to Command & Conquer, and how about also what your favorite Command & Conquer game is?
Alright, I'm going to do those a little bit out of order. Going to start first with how I was introduced to Command & Conquer. As far as I remember, I had a copy of it for Red Alert 1 on the PlayStation 1. As far as I know, that was my first introduction to it. And I thought that was a ton of fun, and then eventually I got it for PC, and that just kind of blew my mind. My favorite CNC probably still is Red Alert 2 and the expansion Yuri's Revenge, just a ton of fun. And that's kind of cliche, that's almost everyone's favorite, but
yeah,
it's that for a reason.
Yeah.
So, and then as far as my involvement in the CNC community, well, years and years ago, back in the Kane's Wrath and Tiberium Wars days, I was really into Command & Conquer, and that's where I kind of first discovered the CNC community, because before that I didn't really have very good internet, and so that was like the first time where I could actually play games online, and so I played Kane's Wrath online. But then sometime around 2010, I stopped playing Command & Conquer for a very specific reason, but we don't really need to go into that.
Okay.
And then just recently, in the past couple of years, I got back into it with Community Battlecast Primetime, which is a web show that I produce with Nod Soldier Girl and Doom Tanker. And then from there, I started doing my own gamecasts on my YouTube channel, and that's basically full, typically 1v1 competitive match commentary over on YouTube. And that pretty much is what got me back into the Command & Conquer community about 2 years ago.
Awesome, Cybert. And of course, you're in the Command & Conquer Alpha.
Yes, I am.
Cybert here will be our eyes and ears. Definitely, we're going to be grilling you a little bit about various aspects. So be ready, my friend. Be ready.
Absolutely.
Very nice to have you with us. We're honored to have you actually with us, and we look forward to some excellent discussion. Also hosting with me today is Sabin, who I've played many matches against in Command & Conquer. Sabin, like myself, is a longtime Command & Conquer player. Sabin, what was your first experience of Command & Conquer, and what would you say is your favorite Command & Conquer of all time?
My first experience with Command & Conquer probably would be watching my brothers play it on the PC. Definitely a long time ago. It was Command & Conquer 1 and Red Alert 1. My first actual Command & Conquer game was Command & Conquer on the Nintendo 64. And I must say, I definitely appreciate more of the mouse and keyboard than the controller.
I bet.
As for my favorite C&C game, I'd probably have to say Command & Conquer 3, mostly because that was when I first started getting more competitive online. I think the only other game I really got into online is Renegade. And
oh yeah, Renegade.
That was a long time ago. But other than that, yeah, that's pretty much it.
Awesome. Well, very nice. Very glad to have you with us today, Sabin. I guess that leaves me. I have been playing Command & Conquer since the very first DOS version of Command & Conquer. It definitely ages me a bit. With the original Red Alert, though, was released, I started making mods for Command & Conquer, and I created a mod called Maxima RA. And I also ran a website, cncmods.com, which was dedicated to all sorts of different mods for Red Alert and such. Now I DJ and host shows on TrekRadio.net, which is dedicated to another free-to-play game, Star Trek Online. But now that Command & Conquer free-to-play is in development, I'm trying to get back to my roots of Command & Conquer. I would say my favorite Command & Conquer game would actually be Generals. Generals I thought was, I don't know, it's just a game, I was my go-to game for a long, long time. And Red Alert 2 was definitely my favorite campaign of all the different Red Alerts. But I even enjoyed Command & Conquer 3 more than most people did, so there you go. Just like them all, I guess. But yeah, alright, well, now that our introductions are out of the way, folks, let's get into today's discussion with our first segment of the show about the game. The new Command & Conquer free-to-play game is the latest iteration of a long-running series of real-time strategy games. If you've never played a Command & Conquer game before, well, first off, shame on you. But in a nutshell, real-time strategy games are all about armies battling for supremacy on the battlefield. There are three core elements to most real-time strategy games: gathering resources, building bases, and building units. These three elements can all be found in popular games like Warcraft, StarCraft, and of course Command & Conquer.
The new C&C free-to-play has been in development since December 10th, 2011, when it was formally announced at the Spike Video Game Awards by the studio BioWare Victory. On August 15th, 2012, it was announced Generals 2 and is repurposed for free-to-play. The game known as simply Command & Conquer. In November 2012, BioWare label was dropped, and the studio was renamed to its former Victory Games. The first invites for Alpha was in March of this year.
So yeah, that's great information. Let's discuss a moment the decision to go free to play, because when I first heard that they were going to change from a sequel to the original Command & Conquer Generals to going to an actual platform of a free-to-play game, I wasn't actually too happy about it at first, because I was always afraid about the pay-to-win aspect. But Cybert, I'll start with you. What do you think about the whole free-to-play concept with a real-time strategy game, and what are the advantages and disadvantages you think of going to that format?
It's hard to say exactly if the game would still exist if it wasn't free-to-play at this point, just because of what they've had to do to create the game. So that kind of sounds like a weird answer, but with starting with Frostbite and then basically developing what was primarily a first-person shooter engine into an RTS engine and the server architecture that exists there, like as something that has a just final release date like a boxed product, I don't know, I mean, how well that would really work as just a box product versus something that is continually being developed and something that they can continually have return on. So if you have like a box product, typically what you see is like, hey, we release the game, we get, X number of sales, and then you sort of see that decay, those numbers decay. But with, episodic content and with DLC in a free-to-play game, you can kind of see, instead of there being a big spike and then it just sort of decaying quickly, you can have a little bit more of a long-term business strategy, which I think, technically, I don't actually work for Victory Games, so maybe I'm wrong, and maybe developing Frostbite for CNC was really easy, which is the exact opposite of what the devs have said, but I think free-to-play is possibly the only way that this game would really actually work. I don't know if it would still exist if it was just a boxed product.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting perspective because, when you think about it, when they first announced, way back when at the Video Game Awards that they were going to make a sequel to Generals, they were shooting for a March of 2013 release, was what they were originally kind of shooting for. And it's kind of hard to imagine with the game, the state it was in. If you think back when you first got into the alpha, that game could have been boxed and released at that time, or even close to, and I know that, if you think about it, it was a huge change, and it had to be a huge change in architecture to go from a standard boxed product to a platform, because you're transforming from just a single game into an entire platform that could basically support enough content equal to several games in a series. And so it must have been challenging for them just to do the back end work, to be able to build a completely online experience, because in a box product you have an online, most of it's offline and you go online to play people. But the entire product had to be shifted into an online platform. And I think that, was one of the things that may have affected the progress of the development of the game. What do you think?
Yeah, I think for a 2013 release date as a boxed product would have been either a really terrible game, which, I mean, Command & Conquer Free-to-Play, or Gens 2, has been a terrible game for most of 2013. But it's an alpha. It's allowed to be terrible. As a boxed product on the open market, it is not allowed to be terrible. So that difference there is either as a boxed product, they would have had to push the development back at least a year, or as a free-to-play game that is, going to be going into open beta, they can get a ton of feedback right now for, 6-7 months. Going on almost 7 months now from just alpha. There's been a ton of feedback that we've been able to provide. And as a result, the game is actually getting to a point where it's starting to get a lot more solid. And it's hard to say if that would have actually been possible with a boxed product. So I think maybe free-to-play is the only way that this game would work. I don't know that it would have been possible in a more traditional boxed product sort of form.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Sam, what do you think?
I definitely agree with both of you guys. At least looking back at the videos and going to what the forum posts, a lot of people are comparing to StarCraft 2 and how close it was, the original they were going for, and how much they have had to change over the past year, just because the enormous amount of feedback saying how bad it was and how close, for example, it was. As for the free-to-play format, you got a lot of challenges in terms of they stated, single-player campaigns will be coming, as well as we don't know if they'll add mod support for who knows, for maps, or new generals maybe.
Yeah, that was a big thing that I definitely was concerned with when I first heard the game was going free to play as a modder, who had modded several of the Command & Conquer games and really enjoyed playing a lot of the mods out there for, especially Generals. You had some great mods for Generals, Contra and Shockwave and all those type of mods were really enjoyable, and I thought that the modding community was going to suffer from going to free to play, and it's kind of, that has yet to be played out, I think, but either way, it's going to be up to the guys over at Victory whether or not they want to support the modding community by releasing modding tools, and how is that going to work on an online game is going to be interesting to see.
Well, I can actually give a preemptive answer to that question. As someone who does not officially represent Victory Games or is affiliated with Victory Games in any way, it's not exactly up to them. So first of all, I mean, since it is based on Frostbite, DICE has to release Frosted, the Frostbite editor, and, SDK sort of stuff, so that mods can actually develop their own stuff. And that's something that, considering that Frostbite is not only just owned by DICE, but also under the publisher EA, that's kind of their premier engine for the Battlefield series, Need for Speed, Command & Conquer, and there's other games that I can't even think of right now that use the Frostbite engine. So the likelihood of them releasing mod tools and SDKs and that sort of thing is unlikely, especially since free-to-play games do depend on it. So while I don't want to be Johnny Raincloud, and there's other factors that affect it as well, as far as just the architecture of how the game works, that make modding and just user-created content pretty much impossible.
Yeah, I definitely agree. It doesn't look, it looks slightly grim for a modder of this game, but on the other hand, we can expect a great deal of more content from the actual developers themselves because of the free-to-play format. They'll be able to, give us updates and new generals and all the new different content that they plan to release on a pretty regular basis to keep the variety there in the game. So that's a little bit of a bright side, I guess you could say, to that. Flip side to that coin.
It's kind of an unfortunate situation because of how prominent mods have been in just Command & Conquer history. And I mean, just not even Command & Conquer, just gaming in general, particularly for PC, how much of part of the community and keeping games alive mods have played a part in. And so mods, it's sad that we are probably going to lose them. I mean, It's possible that we won't, but it's sad. I don't know that there's a way around it, though.
Yeah, it's the reality of the situation when it comes to an online platform.
On another note, EA doesn't exactly have the greatest track record, especially with microtransactions. And I mean, just compared to let's look at The Sims and Nexus.
Yeah.
You always release so much small content, but they just ridiculous amount of price.
Yeah, and we'll go into monetization in a little bit. But as for the game itself, Cyber, it's built upon some solid tech. You mentioned the Frostbite engine. You want to talk about a couple advantages of using the Frostbite and what that means for Command & Conquer?
So basically, Frostbite guarantees that the game will look great, or it guarantees that it can look great, and it does look great. But more importantly, because Frostbite, it's not like the Sage engine where it was sort of old tech. I'm not actually sure who developed Sage. I don't know if it was Westwood or EA. But I mean, they've been using Sage since, early versions of Sage since, I believe, Generals 1. And so it was old tech, but it's oh, here's Frostbite 2. By the way, when Frostbite 3 comes out, Command & Conquer will be running on that. And I don't know, maybe they've started to patch in the new files for Frostbite 3, I'm not entirely sure. But it's really nice to have the Frostbite 2 engine as a foundation, or just the Frostbite engine in general as a foundation, because as long as DICE continues developing that engine, and as long as there's still drive from them, then Command & Conquer will continue to improve. And, I mean, there could be some downsides with that in that it kicks up the barrier for entry. So, I mean, it's free to play. So the barrier for entry in that way is gone. But at the same time, you have to meet certain requirements, which have been brought up quite a bit by Frostbite. But, I mean, potentially it enables some really cool stuff in terms of destructive environments. We have not seen that essentially at all, despite what the marketing says in Command & Conquer yet, but there is a lot of potential for destructible environments.
Yeah, the feedback I've heard from people playing the game in regards to the destructible environments is that, they're pretty and they're fun to look at, but they don't have a lot of functionality in the game. Have you found that to be true, Cyber?
Yes, and in many cases they hamper the game. And it has in part to do with pathing. I don't know how much exactly, but units it's not as bad as it used to be. I should mention it used to be a lot worse, where units would be a lot of times they would be getting caught up on geometry, and it's like, that's a fence, you're a tank, why aren't you running over this little wooden fence? And the tank would sort of do a dance trying to, like, run over this fence.
Oh, boy.
So it's... Yeah, like, technically there's a lot of destructible environment elements, like stuff, sort of doodads on the map. I'm not sure what else you would call them, but I mean, other than that, there's buildings. So there's, like, small destructible things on the map that generally vehicles just drive over, and then they destroy them and they sort of disappear. And then there's buildings, and that's sort of the other aspect of it. And the buildings, I mean, some people would argue that there's too many of them, and I would, for the most part, agree with that, but they're kind of the more interesting aspect of the destructible environment, because, of course, garrisoning infantry in them can provide some nice defense, but then your opponent has the ability to destroy those buildings and clear the map a little bit, or they have to, take that extra damage. So there's some parts of the destructible environment which are functional, but for now, at the current stage, the majority of it is just sort of clutter.
So it sounds like to me, in a lot of ways, they're figuring out how to utilize Frostbite in an RTS environment, because it's never obviously been used for an RTS before. And so there's a lot of different ways they have to figure out how to interact the destructible environments with the units, and pathfinding issues, as you said, become apparent when you do that. So
yeah, and that's the other part that I briefly touched on before, is because they are essentially carving their own path, there's not exactly an example that they can turn to. It's like, oh, here's this other RTS game that was also developed on the Frostbite engine, we'll just take a look at what they did. It's kind of like, well, we've got this new server architecture, which is completely different from previous CNC games. We've got this new engine, which is completely different. And we're supposed to release in 2013? What? So they have a ton of work, and obviously they're very hard-working devs. Just the amount of progress that they've made is a testament to that.
Yeah, I also heard, I think it was from Gamescom, that the planes weren't being included because of Frostbite problems. Maybe it was something to do with the pathing of the planes taking off and landing, or just how they interact with the ground, or we haven't really heard too much about the planes, have we?
Yes and no. I mean, there's not a lot of specifics about fixed-wing aircraft, but we have heard about them basically as, they're not in, they'll be in. That's pretty much what everyone says. It's like, hey, why aren't fixed-wing aircraft in? And then someone will immediately reply, they're not in because it doesn't work, but they'll be in later. So that's kind of the general feel. And there's a lot of stuff that, because of the server architecture, because of Frostbite, they're not quite have it figured out, such as crushing and fixed-wing aircraft. And, I mean, before, when they did have, like, the actual runways on the airfield, as I'm sure many people who have been checking out footage or are in the alpha know, that there used to be actual runways on the airfields that are now gone, and they're just sort of like this little hub. And they actually, of course, the runways were for the fixed-wing aircraft that they didn't get a chance to implement because, yeah, they had those problems, as you guys already mentioned. And the airstrips themselves actually were causing issues where they would be, like, jutting off of the edge of cliffs, or they would be, you could actually see the ground, like, poking up through the airstrips, and so they were causing all sorts of geometry problems. They were unwieldy to place, really awkward, and until they get things like crushing, until they get fixed-wing aircraft to a point of where it's really smooth and it works for everyone, and it actually functions properly, they can't really push it out to everyone.
Yeah, most definitely. And those, among some other missing or incomplete features, we'll go over in our detailed gameplay discussion in just a few moments. But let's get back on track for just a moment and talk about the whole basically theory of monetization, because obviously the flip side to a free-to-play game is, they've got to make money somehow. The most important goal, obviously, is to avoid a pay-to-win scenario where those who pay real money gain an unfair advantage over those who decide to just grind it out in the game. But the entire monetization scheme of Command & Conquer Free-to-Play, I don't think has been quite fully developed, but there are some things we know so far, and I think we'll talk about those. Let's first talk about the game currencies. Now, if I'm correct, Cyber, there's two different currencies, what I like to call the grind or pay currencies, because depending on what you do or how you get the each of the currencies. But I believe there's is it CP and VP. Am I correct about that?
Yes, you are. Yeah, the command points or the victory points. Command points being those that you earn in-game through, commanding and conquering and things. And then the victory points, which you get to buy with real money.
I gotcha. Okay. So there are definitely several things you can buy with your command points or victory points. First off being the generals themselves. That's really seems to be the real money maker of Command & Conquer Free-to-Play right now, is each of the sub-factions are generals themselves. They've got a lot of character to them. They each have their own names. They have their own, a little bit tweak on the main faction's units. They have some unique units of their own. What do you think about Cyber as just a way to make money? What do you think of the generals as a sound business plan when it comes to making money off the game?
I mean, it can be, and that's sort of the pitfall of free-to-play, is they have to make money, and so they can take something which could be a really good idea and that would make sense and not be pay-to-win, and then suddenly, if the time is right, they can turn it into something that is pay-to-win. So, for example, generals, they could be great as things that are... Right now, they seem to be good. I should rephrase that as right now they seem to be all right if you purchase them, because it's not like, hey, here's this general that you can only purchase with money that is better, that is just straight up better. And so there are generals that you can purchase with money that are better, but you can also grind for those generals, and they're only better because the balance hasn't been, nailed down yet because it's an alpha. So it's hard to say, exactly how much will pay to win come in, but for now, it seems to be that they're geared, and of course the devs have confirmed this time and time and time again that they don't want it to be pay to win, and that's of course a very good way to kill something like a strategy game, is to make it pay to win. So they don't want to do that, the players don't want that, nobody really wants that, and so for now, it looks like they're poised in a great position to not make it pay to win, and still sell generals and still sell customization and that sort of thing.
Most definitely. It feels to me it's a tight rope that they have to walk, because on the one hand, you want to make the generals appealing as a purchase, because you want to make people not only want to grind for them, but maybe those type of impulse buyers who say, hey, I want that general, I want to play as that general and use those units. At the same time, though, you have to make the general interesting enough, but yet you don't want to make it overpowered. So it's that kind of balance that they have to walk. And right now, it feels to me, in my opinion, that the generals are a little bit more flair over substance, where they're really, their character, they have beautiful artwork. There's a lot of character to them. They're really bold characters. They're named. They have backstories, and all that kind of stuff. But when it comes down to the differentiation of the units and their unique units that they have, I don't know how much they actually changed the play style of the base faction. If they actually, if you have a particular GLA general, for example, if you're not going to play the same way as you would with the base GLA general for the most part. And I think that's going to be the tightrope they have to walk, because they have to make these generals attractive, but they want to make them obviously not overpowered as they release new ones.
Yeah, that's one of the things that we do need to save for the full discussion on probably the next episode, is just sub-faction design, because quite frankly, they're not there yet. But that's the other part of it, is you were talking about differentiation, which is great, because the generals, that's what they're supposed to be. It's supposed to be like, okay, here's a overall faction, now here's different play styles and different tactics within that faction. You get to choose and sort of find one that suits you best, but right now, because there are things that are missing from the game and the balance isn't locked down, like some generals just don't have certain units, and other generals, they basically said, okay, this general is missing, let's say, a late game counter to aircraft, so we're going to just copy this temporarily from General X over here, we're going to paste it on General Y as a temporary balance fix. So instead of, they don't have whatever unit that is that's supposed to fill that role for that general, they don't have it done yet. So they'll just sort of copy something from another general and paste it there as a temporary fix. So it's hard to tell exactly how well all of the generals will mesh, just because of problems like that, which of course will become resolved as the game gets more and more complete.
Great points, Cybert. Sabin, you have anything related to generals you want to talk about?
Well, I don't know about you two, but out of the games, I would love one of the factions and play one of the factions majority of the time. So for Command and Conquer 3, I was always playing GDI using the Mammoth Tank strategy, and I really did not explore Siren and Nod at all, and that's going to also be something they have to overcome, is entice them to want to move away from the original generals that someone might end up loving, and try these new generals out. Because once you get into a lock and find a strategy you really like, you may not end up switching.
Yeah, that's definitely. I mean, the players will have their favorites that they'll want to go to time and time again. But I think, I don't know. For me, variety is the spice of life. I'll definitely want to be trying out a few different ones. And if they have, 20 different generals to choose from, it's going to be pretty tempting to try different style of gameplay.
Yeah, I really like, Seven, that you brought up the point of Kane's Wrath, because, of course, in Kane's Wrath, you've got the sub-factions, and the primary difference there, just other than completeness, is that you buy the game, and then you've got access to all of them. So right now, what we have is generals that cost, I believe, between about 700 and 1,000 victory points, or in the range of, now I can't remember the numbers. I want to say, 7,000 command points, which it's like, okay, so you start with your 3 base generals, your GLA, EU, and APA base generals, and then you have to do a significant amount of playing to actually get any generals other than that. So in a way, they've kind of forced players into alright, here's a little taste of each of the factions, figure out which one you like best, and then you just sort of have to build on that one faction, because otherwise you're going to have to spend, all day, all night playing to be able to unlock every general for every faction without paying. So it's a tough spot that they're in right now, but again, it is alpha, and I don't expect that these are going to be the final prices, because based on what you get from a game, I mean, winning gives you, of course, more command points than losing does, so you have to be consistently winning a lot of matches to be able to actively unlock generals. So, I mean, if you choose EU, you're going to have a tough enough time just unlocking all of the EU generals, particularly if they're constantly adding new ones on a month-by-month basis or even a quarterly basis. You're going to have a lot of trouble trying to unlock those. So for some people, they're going to love it because there's always going to be a lot of stuff to get, and for other people, they're going to feel like, oh, well, unless I want to spend huge amounts of hours playing this game, I'm going to have to buy these generals to sort of get that variety that maybe they experienced in Kane's Wrath or in the original 0 Hour.
Yeah, great points. And just speculation, what do you think going to be the actual? Do they have a dollar breakout for the victory points, or can you purchase them in the alpha at this point?
Yes, you can, and that has introduced to some degree a bit of controversy, because there's the premium mode in the alpha currently, which originally when they launched, I think it was the August patch, which was the patch that they sort of demoed at Gamescom, there was this new edition called Premium, which would allow you to do certain things if you paid for it. So you would get more options, say in terms of what color you want to play in-game. You would get more options in, say, there would be fun-based game modes, but they also included things like 1v1 under the premium feature, and so after everyone freaked out on them for that and being like, why is 1v1 a premium feature you have to pay for, they sort of backed off, and so now everyone in the alpha has currently 60 days of free premium, and then I'm assuming when that ends, they'll go ahead and reset it, because basically they were like, okay, everyone gets free premium for now, so you can do your game modes and all of that, but then other than that, there is a dollar breakdown because you can purchase victory points in the alpha, which is a little bit disconcerting. Yeah. I mean, it's similar to if anyone's following Hearthstone, they did a reset, they did a patch, and everyone got the money that they had spent, they got it back. And it's the same thing here. If you spend money, you get your money back, I believe, until the open beta. At that point, I'm not exactly sure, but I think that's the point that they mentioned, that you will no longer be receiving a refund. Do not quote me on that. I'm trying to go based on memory. I don't have an article pulled up in front of me. So yeah, you can spend money in the alpha, which of course is a little disconcerting. The ramification of that being that you get that money back when they do a wipe. So it's not like you're losing it At least as long as we don't have any problems like in GTA where people are just losing money. Hopefully we won't have anything like that.
That'd be wild. Well, yeah, there we go. Well, I guess as time goes by, we'll learn more about how they implement the whole pricing scheme on that. But there is one other thing you can buy in the game on top of the actual generals themselves, and these are almost on the border, in my opinion, of almost like microtransactions. They have game customizations to your player powers, where there's the extra slot at the end. There's basically, you have 4 basic player powers, and then there's like a 5th slot that's blank. And before the match, you can kind of purchase with your points a temporary power that's basically a 1 shot per game, if I understand it. Or basically you buy it and it lasts for 1 game, and then if you want to use it on another game, you have to buy it again. Does that make sense? Is that what you've been seeing in there, Cybert?
To some degree, I believe what the official term is perks. So perks are basically, well, they're perks that affect the gameplay. They actually do affect gameplay and balance, but currently there is no way to purchase them with real money. So if you want to purchase perks, which affect all sorts of different things, I don't have them all memorized, at least not yet, and so they affect different things such as build times or different unit characteristics. I believe there's some that increase speed, others that increase damage. So they definitely alter the game, and so it's sort of borderline of being pay to win, and they do kind of have a microtransaction feel, but because you cannot purchase them with real money, they can kind of get away with it because, yeah, and also there's ways that they can integrate the perks into the ranking system. So for example, let's imagine that it's, the game has released and we're playing on ladder, and I am rank whatever, I'm rank X, and I have every single perk, and you are rank Y, and let's say that we're in similar rank, but you have none of the perks. From what I've heard, I believe that there is almost no way that you and I would get matched up against each other because our perks don't match. So basically there will be a part of the algorithm which assesses what perks the player has. So if I have a lot of perks on my general that would inherently make me a lot better, that would give me a big advantage, I won't be getting matched against players who have less perks. So it'll be factored into the algorithm from what I understand. But currently there is no way to purchase those with real money. Of course, that could potentially change in the future, but then we really do reach a point where that is become almost free to play. And then the other sort of gateway on the perks is that they're limited based on level. So you can only buy the ones that you have sort of unlocked with your faction level. So you have an EU, APA, and GLA level, and I believe that those are the levels that determine what perks you can unlock, and then you have to purchase those perks with command points.
That makes sense. Well, yeah, we'll have to see what will happen as far as making that free to play, or pay to win, I should say, avoiding that scenario with those. But they definitely have a loophole there, not allowing you to purchase it with real money. But you do have to, those hard-earned, experience points that you use on those are definitely something that you could put towards a general later on, and so you have to kind of be budget minded for those of us who are going to choose to grind the game instead of actually paying real money for the generals. Obviously taking CP out of your pocket, for example, that you could be putting towards a general, would be a concern to balance out as a player.
Yeah, they've certainly set up an interesting playfield for themselves in terms of balance with all of the different generals, with all of the different perks. And I mean, they seem fairly confident that they can do it, so it's again one of those things that there's no answer currently. There's no like, oh, well, of course, this is how it's all going to pan out. We just have to watch and
Exactly.
wait.
And we will watch and wait. As time goes by, again, we'll learn more about how they plan to make more money off the game. But now let's bring folks up to speed real quick on a couple of the latest developments in the news in Command & Conquer Catching Up. Gamescom was in August, and that was the real, for me as a fan watching from the outside and not being part of the alpha, Gamescom was the first time I really got to see some live gameplay. But it also represented a big change in the direction, I think, of the game. And Cyber, this is something I really want to drill you on because you were at Gamescom, and basically this is the point I felt where they had the Gamescom patch, as it was called, or the Gamescom build. I think it was how they were referring to it during the videos. There's a bunch of videos that you folks out there can catch on YouTube that are EA videos that they did every day. They talked about the game. They went into different factions, and the folks over at EA did a real good job with that. But what did you think, Cyber, as being there, seeing the new Gamescom build? Because when you went to Gamescom, was that the first time you saw that build compared to the builds you were playing previously?
Yes, and there was actually a couple of different builds that we ended up playing at Gamescom. So there was basically the August build, which was the August build minus a few things. And curiously enough, they had left out perks from that particular build, and they had also grayed out, for the most part. I believe Premium was completely grayed out, so like you could click on it, but you couldn't actually like purchase any. So those were sort of the first taste of the August build. And then from there, I think it was maybe about a week or a week and a half from the end of Gamescom until it was released. So basically after Gamescom, the devs went back to LA and basically put the last round of polish on that. And then the second build that we ended up playing at Gamescom, which was just in the CNC Community Lounge, was a kind of an experimental balance build where it was like, hey, we're kind of trying to rebalance the game, so we're not really happy with the direction of the game. We're looking to change things up, and some key team members had a lot to do with that particular build, and so it was kind of just a test that we only got to play for a few hours. That was just sort of like, hey, here's a new idea, what do you think of it?
Yeah, and it definitely seems like that's the point where they started to, and I don't know, from looking on the forums in the Alpha, Cyber, if you noticed that a lot of the feedback was relating to the way the game was, the direction the game was going, and specifically its similarities to the StarCraft feel of gameplay as it progressed. But it seemed like it was at that point where the player feedback started to influence the developers to actually go in a different direction with the game.
Yeah, there was definitely way too many similarities between Command & Conquer and StarCraft, and there's actually a number of good reasons as to why that was, and part of it was just because it's like, well, here's a starting point. This is not necessarily the end goal, but this is a point that we can start from. And then, of course, they got a huge amount of backlash for that, for kind of choosing that as their starting point. And I mean, it still has ramifications just in, for example, map design, which the maps have been heavily revised, and hopefully there will be more map revisions coming soon. But I mean, the maps, even people who have they're not even in the alpha, they've seen footage, they're like, wait a second, that looks like map X from StarCraft 2, and then it's actually laid out very similarly, and it has, similar sort of main natural expansion sort of setup with very similarly choked bases and similarly choked maps. So there was a few too many similarities, and of course that was one of the things that they talked about at Gamescom in one of the meetings that we had. Was they had sort of like an outstanding feedback slide which said something like eliminate StarCraft 2 and then rectify CNC, and something about making it more similar to the original Generals.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was a bit too similar to StarCraft 2 and a bit strange compared to Generals.
Yeah, it wasn't a familiar feeling game, is what a lot of people had said, but definitely an aspect to the similarities of StarCraft. Not just you had the map design and the choke points, as you mentioned, Cyber, but you also before that point, that was when they actually changed up from going from a 2-resource system into a single resource system.
Yeah, oil derricks used to be sort of Vespene gas, but they had never really got the development of the 2-resource system locked down, and so it was always just sort of this, like, maybe this'll work, maybe not, and then they actually came up with, in my opinion, what is a great idea, something that I didn't even think of out of it, and so I was just sort of like, okay, they'll kind of figure out how they want to use this Vespene gas sort of alternative, how they want to use oil and really integrate it to the gameplay. I'm sure, that'll become more apparent down the road. And then, yeah, at that patch, they were just like, by the way, we've completely changed it, and it's awesome now. And so now you see, if you watch a lot of gameplay, particularly among I don't want to use the word higher level players just because it's the alpha, and certainly level doesn't matter. It's more about feedback. But between the players who are better than others, you see a lot of interaction that has to deal with the oil derricks. The oil derricks. So I think it's a really good and interesting change. And of course, it's similar to previous CNCs, but it's also innovative. So it's a nice change.
I 100% agree. I like the change. I think it's a great idea because, oil derricks in the original generals are almost just like a nice bonus to have, but you knew that once your opponent blew that oil derrick up, that it was gone. And, then it was over. So you either had to spend a great deal of effort and money defending it, or just, hope that you can get as much out of it before they blew it up. Now, because you can actually build oil derricks on top of the oil wells, you can rebuild them if they're destroyed by your enemies, and becomes a more viable and more, something you want to defend, because you're not just defending the structure, but now you're defending the well itself, which cannot be destroyed.
Yeah, and of course, as playing as a faction, if you decide to, as say like GLA, you've got lots of cheap workers, you can throw down a command center, eliminate that fog hack, and then send workers all over the map. And instead of taking, say, your natural expansion, which may be much closer in proximity, you can get a whole bunch of effectively small expansions spread throughout the map. So there's some interesting different tactics that are possible. And I mean, the change is pretty much, as far as I can tell, only good. And it can only... The main thing that I'm thinking of is capturing buildings, which is something that we discussed, and as soon as they mentioned that, it's like, well, wait a second, that completely changes the dynamics of oil derricks once again, because now, instead of saying, oh, well, of course, my opponent built an oil derrick, I'm going to go destroy it, you say, oh, well, if I have this unit, which doesn't cost as much as building an oil derrick, and I can capture that oil derrick, well, suddenly, I can save money and then get that income. So that's another thing that could just change that even more.
Yeah, and the capturing mechanic is not yet in the game, but we hope it will be, because it's definitely an important part of Command & Conquer. But let's move along a little bit here, because we are starting to run short on time. So we're, obviously the NDA has been lifted. That means there was a non-disclosure agreement that alpha players were under that basically limited what they could say, and of course said, hey, you shouldn't put things online and videos and things like that. But it's been lifted now. You folks out there can catch, if you just go on YouTube and just Google Command & Conquer Alpha or CNC Alpha, there's tons and tons of gameplay videos online, people sharing their experiences on the game. In upcoming episodes, we're going to be chatting with a couple of the authors of these YouTube videos about their experiences with the game. But let's continue. We've kind of gone in depth in a lot of the different things, but we're going to go over a few things that we haven't yet touched upon as far as gameplay discussion of the new Command & Conquer free-to-play game. So let's continue to dissect, opinionate, and speculate about every detail of the game with in-depth discussion. We talked about the graphics and everything look great, and the build of the game. We also mentioned that mechanics and unit movement are still not quite there yet. Pathfinding is something that is somewhat of an issue with the destructible environments. Did you have any other experiences, Cyber, when it came to pathfinding and movement? I know that there was one thing I wanted to mention, that was that I don't think they have reverse move in the game yet.
No, they don't. Reverse move and directional armor are something that was, well, they've been a hot topic since the beginning, because of course that was something introduced, I believe, in Tiberium Wars. As far as I can remember, you can't reverse move in generals, but you had other options. And so it was something that was introduced, and everyone pretty much immediately latched onto it. They don't have it in just yet, but it's something that they've been aware of for a very long time, and there are people who are working on the game, in the dev team, who really want reverse move in there for a number of reasons. So yeah, reverse move, again, it's another thing that's not in the game, and there's plenty of reasons as to why it isn't, and some of those have to do with architecture, but there's reasons as to why it's not in the game, but it seems like it's one of those things that's like, yeah, we want it, everyone wants it, but it's not there just yet.
Among some of the other things we've seen in there. But I would say that it should hopefully be high up on their list, because I know that it was a pretty viable strategy, especially with tanks. Is driving away from your opponent as they chase you, but be able to fire your main turrets at your enemy as they're chasing you was a viable option. I used to kind of micro that way when I had tanks in the game, especially if I had faster tanks or like the Battle Masters and things like that. All right, we're going to keep things moving along. We've got a couple other things that we wanted to talk about. Compared to the original Generals, there are a few other differences with the new Command & Conquer free-to-play game gameplay mechanics. First of all, we have infantry squads I've seen have made a return. This is something they did in Command & Conquer 3, but didn't do as much in Generals.
Everything but commandos and workers for the GLA. And personally, I'm not a fan of it, and the devs have kind of, as far as I know, gone back and forth on whether or not they're cosmetic or not, because if squads are purely cosmetic, then it seems, well, why do we have them? And if they're not purely cosmetic, then they really do need to be fixed. Personally, I'm not a fan of most sort of squads. GLA mobs would pretty much be the exception. Other than that, I prefer just single infantry mobs. They're just a bit messy overall.
Yeah, Sam, what do you prefer when it comes to infantry?
It's hard to say. I'm not a huge infantry person, but I definitely see the pros and cons. I think Command & Conquer 3 had groups, for at least for their basic infantry. I think there were groups in 4. It's been a while since I've played. But for commandos, they definitely played a big part in at least Carmen Gel. Can't even say his name right.
The Jamin Kell.
Yeah, for GLA, he played a huge impact on the battlefield, knocking out vehicles. You knock out a dozer, and played a big giant impact on gameplay. Do they have? You said they didn't have those in there just for cosmetic?
Well, no, they still have commandos like they did. I mean, there's also debate as to how useful commandos are, and they're certainly not finished. But as far as squads goes, for example, if you think back to Command & Conquer 3 and Kane's Wrath, pretty much everything is a squad with the exception of, like, commandos and engineers. Everything else is a squad. And so that presented some interesting options, because one of the great things in terms of just basic micro is the idea of focus firing. So if I have, 2 tanks and my opponent has 2 tanks and one of their tanks is at half health, I'm going to be taking less damage if I focus fire the tank that's at half health versus the tank that's at full health and take that one down first. So, and there's actually a great article that AGM wrote about this on Game Replays, and I'll kind of give you the brief version that squads, it's like, if they're not cosmetic, then they take away that sort of micro entirely, because as the squad gets eliminated, it does less damage, so there's no reason to focus fire necessarily. And if they're not cosmetic, well, then they're just messy, and they're just like, here's extra units to clutter up the map that apparently serve no function. So, for example, a recon squad, if it's purely cosmetic, then one unit, if it's only one unit standing, then he'll do as much damage as all 3. So focus firing and how much health something has left would make a difference in that case. But if that's the case of they're purely cosmetic, then they're just messy.
Yeah, and I think the answer may lie somewhere in between, to have standard units individual, but maybe have unique squads that can be trained for special purposes, like a sniper squad and so on and so forth. That's multiple units, and they may have some kind of advantage to having that. But when it comes to general units, I agree with you, Cyber, that I also support individual units when it comes to on the battlefield, because it does kind of just clutter up things when you have a bunch of units that really don't serve a bunch of purpose. So another thing they changed, I wanted to touch on, was build order. Build order has been changed in new Command & Conquer in the fact that you don't start with your command center anymore. Now you start with a supply center. From your experience to Cyber playing the game, how has that changed your strategy and overall take on the game?
Well, it hasn't necessarily changed a whole lot other than now you don't have to build a supply center, which personally I like the idea of starting with a command center first. And of course, one of the things that starting with the command center first did in generals is it gave you an extra $1,000 if you sold it off immediately. So you'd see pretty much everyone just sold off their command center once they built a couple of extra dozers or workers, because why would you keep it around? You get extra money. And so I think that was part of the reason why they chose to go with supply centers first. I know this has been discussed almost to death in the alpha forums, and for right now I can't actually remember the real reasons that they gave for as why they wanted to start with the supply center. And some people have suggested, oh, of course, it's because StarCraft 2 does that, so that must be what they're doing. I think it's really weird. It's definitely an odd choice from a Command & Conquer history point of view, where starting with a resource collecting building rather than your actual command center. And I think that if they revise the role of command centers, there's no reason why you shouldn't start with a command center. Because personally, if you think about just, say, Kane's Wrath, or even Red Alert 3 just being the most recent examples, as well as, I mean, this can even apply to Generals in Zero Hour, that gave you more options as far as an opening. So maybe the first thing that you want to build is your resource collecting station. So maybe the first thing that you build is your supply center, or maybe you end up going for a forward barracks before that supply center. And so that introduces its own sort of ramifications, because going for that later supply center is obviously going to put you behind economically. Or maybe you find just the perfect location where you can actually skip getting a natural expansion supply and actually just get one general, just start with one building your first supply in a different location than it would be, say, where it is now with it being preset. So it gives, in my opinion, more options to start with the command center, but with the way they've built the game right now, it doesn't make sense to start with command center. So I think they would have to revise the role, but personally, I'm in favor of starting command center first.
Yeah, I think maybe just because I'm traditional and I haven't played the new game, and I just don't know how it really feels different, but I would say that I would prefer the command center also, but it has introduced another interesting mechanic into the game, and that's related to the fog of war, because they have created an incentive for building a command center, because I have it right, you can see the other person's map if you build the command center first. Is that right, Cyber, or is it the other way around?
It's actually, that's almost right. It's basically, if you don't build a command center, your opponent can see through the fog of war. They can see your buildings. So no matter what you do, they can see your buildings no matter where they are on the map. So it completely negates the reason for scouting. And one of the reasons that they stated for as to why they sort of have that fog hack is, well, we wanted to counter build order poker, and this is, one of the ways that we can counter build order poker, and it also offers these other sort of benefits. And I really don't like it. So if you want to stop the fog hack, you have to build your command center, and you can see through the fog until your opponent builds their command center. Personally, I'm not a fan of it. I would prefer if there was just a proper scout and anti-scout sort of mechanic built into the game. And there's a number of different ways that they could do that, which, I mean, it would probably take quite a while to discuss.
Definitely, and we can go into that next time when we talk about specific factions and their units and what they lack. But we already talked about the journalism perk system and some of the in-game economy options. We didn't mention, though, that there is, at this point, a lack of late-game economy. And what I mean by, obviously, that, if you guys remember in the original Generals, they had the supply drops for the USA faction. They had the hackers for China, and so on and so forth. And what these were as alternate options, so when your stack of supplies ran out, you have another income as a late game option. What have you seen has been the feel? Because I know a lot of people have requested that they add this to the game. What have you heard as far as adding any kind of late game economy option?
I actually want to pass this one along to Sabin first.
Okay, go for it, Sabin. What do you think as far as late game economy? Would you like to see them put that in the game?
Definitely. One of the things I noticed watching the videos, and maybe it's because the maps are so big, but you don't seem, or maybe just because the matches don't last very long, but you don't seem to be running around out of resources from at least your main resource space. This is not running out. I don't know if, like I said, I don't know if it's because the match is so short, or this their resources are just so massive. But I definitely want to see the ability to stay in your own base and not have to really spread out. Or if something happens where your outside economy gets knocked out, you have some backup through hackers or for GLA as a marketplace. I want to see that in the game.
Yeah, well, it seems to force exploration of the map that wasn't required in Generals. I remember in Generals, and it was a gameplay style that some people don't, some people say it's not a legitimate gameplay style, but I would say, especially with the special weapons general that you had in the original Command & Conquer Generals, that it would be. And that's just basically sitting back and building a really fortified base in the corner of your map and just kind of sitting there and you're not expanding out, and then just using your special weapons or air force to go out and fight your battles for you. And that's something that doesn't seem like it would be present in the new game, at least as it sits, because of the fact that you can't, you have to eventually go out and expand and build at least oil derricks, or go out and actually claim new supply piles.
Right, I wanted to get both of your perspectives on that before I actually said anything, because I come from sort of a more competitive focused background, so I myself am not very particularly good at RTS. I'm not the one who's out there winning a tournament, but I do enjoy that sort of gameplay, and so I would prefer a game that's more oriented towards high-end, particularly 1v1 play, versus something that's a little more quote-unquote casual. And so, for me, is there actually a reason to have late-game economy currently? No, and personally, I am very happy to see it go from the original Generals, because as you already mentioned, Dub, there was a lot of sort of camping that would be possible because of those late-game income options that simply isn't possible here. So, for example, I was playing a game the other day, and as I was playing as EU, I opened up, and everything's going fine for me. I do a little bit of early damage, and then I notice that the guy just isn't moving out from his base. So in Generals, particularly with with the maps the way they are right now, where they're very choked up, they're very campy, that game, which ended up being about 15 minutes, probably would have drawn on to about 30 minutes, where basically it's just me trying to gain enough income to actually bust open his base and end the game, while he could just sort of sit there and, build up that late game economy. So personally, I'm glad to see it go, because in that particular situation, I had taken like 3 expansions and a bunch of oil derricks, and since he had just stayed in his base, his income was nothing compared to mine, and so that gave me, of course, a huge army advantage and allowed me to just roll over him. Whereas, in Generals, you could get away with playing a little bit more campy. Of course, at the higher levels, that wouldn't really work, but camping was a much more viable strategy than it is now, where now you actually have to be aggressive. As you mentioned, you have to go out, you have to explore the map, and that sort of thing. So personally, I'm very happy to see it go, and right now, actually, Sabin, you actually already mentioned this, but there's not really any reason for it right now. Players aren't really running out of money between oil derricks and the numerous expansions that are on most maps. You really don't run out of cash before the game ends.
That's a good point. I mean, obviously, the funds just need to be there to facilitate a good battle, and as you touched on, it's not as exciting. Obviously, Command & Conquer Free-to-Play wants to be an esports platform. I assume that would be its ultimate goal, to be, on par with something like League of Legends or something like that, that's played by millions of people across the world and also broadcasted. And the games have to be exciting to watch as well as to play. And so, if you've got campers, so to speak, and, one man's strategy is another man's trolling, but, camping, whether it be a viable strategy or not, it's still was something that wasn't very exciting to watch from an onlooker's perspective when it came to that. So you've definitely made some great points there. The lack of late game economy was the thing I did not like about it, but I'm very happy that they've compensated by creating a more competitive and resource rich map to work with. So there you go. A couple other things we're going to touch on before we wrap things up. We touched on a lot of the missing features of the game. Infantry crushing reverse fire is not there, and capturing buildings and that kind of thing. So we don't have to go over that again. But do want to bring people up to speed as far as the development. Everybody's asking the question, and of course we don't have the answer either. But when is the open beta going to start? And we don't have any idea, obviously, when that will be. But we do have a few indications as of to where the development is leading through the end of this year at least. And that is from a Gamescom roadmap that we kind of leaked out from their little meeting that mentioned some of their milestones that they want to go through during the next couple of months in regards to the game. And we are in October, and it looks like they're on par because they did just release a new patch with 2 new generals. Is that correct, Cyber?
Well, you're actually a little bit behind, and that's purely because there was a balance patch today.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah, just actually a few hours ago, I was actually setting up a dual cast for my YouTube channel and with another good friend of mine, and we were about to launch into the game, and then suddenly one of my friends couldn't connect, and he was like, well, what's going on? And then we checked the website, and they had literally scheduled a patch for today. But yeah, the patch before that, they added, I believe, French and Russian support, and then also the 2 generals. I just pulled up the roadmap, and the only thing that I cannot really speak about too much, I mean, there were more balance changes in that late September patch, and, I mean, more feedback changes, but, I mean, other than that, support full player load, which initially we were kind of cautious as to what that meant. Maybe that meant open beta, but I mean, apparently that's sort of a note that's purely for the developers, which was, we just want to have our servers to a more stable place, a place where we could open up and let a lot more people on if we wanted to. And I mean, that hasn't happened. And then the other note is onslaught mode, which as far as I know, and I believe I checked today, it was still grayed out. So onslaught mode is something that you've probably seen if you've seen people leaking alpha footage. Basically, it was a co-op mode where you would play with another person and you would play against AI. So there were various waves of AI that would come at you. You had various objectives. And as far as I know, they have not brought onslaught mode back. So other than that, that's sort of the one sort of missing thing in that roadmap.
Oh, okay, gotcha. Yeah, so they have moving into late November. It looks like they may be releasing 2 more generals, according to their. We don't really have any information on what those 2 generals may be. As we move into November, I guess we'll find out more on that. And of course, they are, as you said, releasing balance patches pretty regularly. It sounds like, if they just released one today.
Yeah, there's roughly a balance. The kind of idea is like a balance patch in the middle of the month and then a content patch at the end of the month. And of course, the content patch isn't restricted to just like, well, we're just going to add more generals. It's a content and balance patch. And I know one of the things that it's coming next month is Lupa, the EU general. And I'm not sure what other general they plan on adding, or if I'm even aware of that general, because of course there's generals that they've got planned, which could be something that they haven't talked about at all. And so yeah, I'm not sure exactly what is going to be added other than the stuff that's just listed on that roadmap there.
Well, yeah, we'll just have to keep an eye out and keep track of their releases and what they have. On our next episode, we'll be going more into the factions and actually talking about each of the generals and what they have as far as powers, and so you folks can get an idea of what they have, and if they've got any new generals at the time, we'll bring you folks up to date. But I think it's time to wrap things up for this episode, our first episode of CommandCast. I want to thank my co-hosts, Saban and Cybert. Thanks, guys, for joining the show. It was a great honor to have both of you on the show today.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It was a ton of fun.
Most definitely. Remember to check the CommandCast blog for the latest news and episodes. And if you would like to follow Cybert online, you can subscribe to his YouTube channel. Just search for Cybert. Or you can email him at cybert.replays@gmail.com. Also be sure to check out the Community Battlecast Primetime Videocast. As for Saban and I, you can reach us via the contact form on the CommandCast blog located at commandcast.blogspot.com. And don't forget to follow our CommandCast channel on YouTube for the latest uploads. On behalf of Saban and Cybert, thank you very much for listening to CommandCast. I am Dub C. We'll see you next time.